In the sun-baked hills of New Mexico Territory, 1885, the Anderson Ranch stood as a testament to hard work and determination. Rose Anderson wasn't what most folks would expect of a rancher's wife. Behind her gentle smile and flour-dusted apron lay the heart of a woman who could outshoot any man west of the Mississippi. Few knew that before marrying Thomas Anderson, she'd earned her living as a stagecoach guard, with more confirmed takedowns than any lawman in 3 states. The morning started like any other, with Rose tending to her sourdough starter while watching dust clouds rise from the distant horizon. Thomas had left at dawn to handle business in town, leaving her to manage the ranch hands and daily chores. The approaching riders didn't worry her at first. Visitors weren't uncommon at their prosperous cattle operation. But something felt off about these particular visitors. Their approach was too deliberate, too coordinated. Rose casually moved her hand to the smooth wooden handle of the rolling pin on the counter, beneath which lay one of her many hidden revolvers. Years of experience had taught her to keep protection within arm's reach at all times. 3 riders pulled up to the house, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of red dust. The leader, a weather-beaten man with a scraggly beard, dismounted first. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached the porch. "Ma'am, sorry to trouble you, but we're looking for Thomas Anderson." Rose kept her expression neutral, though her mind was already calculating angles and distances. "I'm afraid my husband's away on business. Is there something I can help you with?" The man's smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Actually, ma'am, there is." His hand moved to his gun belt, and Rose's fingers tightened around the rolling pin. "You see, your husband's been causing some trouble for our operation up north. Stopping our cattle runs, reporting to the marshals. We figured taking his wife might convince him to mind his own business." What happened next would later become legend in 3 territories. As the first man reached for his gun, Rose had already drawn her hidden revolver. Her first shot caught him square in the shoulder, spinning him backward off the porch. The second outlaw barely cleared leather before Rose's bullet found his gun hand, sending his weapon flying. The third man, younger and quicker than his companions, managed to get off a shot that splintered the doorframe beside Rose's head. Her return fire was deliberate and precise, 1 shot to his thigh, dropping him from his horse. All 3 men were down in less time than it took for her biscuits to rise in the oven. Rose kept her gun trained on the wounded men as she calmly stepped off the porch. "Now then, gentlemen. I suggest you take your injured pride and your bleeding wounds and ride out of here. But before you go, I want you to carry a message back to whoever sent you." The leader groaned, clutching his shoulder as he looked up at her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Rose continued, her voice as steady as her aim, "Tell them that the next time they want to send a message to my husband, they'd better send more than 3 men. And tell them that Rose Anderson doesn't take kindly to uninvited guests who threaten her family." The wounded outlaws struggled to their horses, their faces pale with pain and humiliation. As they rode away, Rose watched until their dust clouds disappeared over the horizon. Then she returned to her kitchen, checked on her biscuits, and added a note to the day's list of chores: clean guns, patch bullet holes in the doorframe, and send word to the marshal about 3 wounded men heading north. That evening, when Thomas returned home to find bullet holes in the porch and the smell of fresh biscuits in the air, Rose simply smiled and said, "We had some unexpected visitors today, dear. Nothing I couldn't handle." She didn't mention that while serving dinner, she'd already begun planning additional security measures for the ranch. After all, the next group might bring more than 3 men, and Rose Anderson believed in being prepared. The event would have remained just another quiet tale of frontier justice, if not for a young ranch hand who witnessed the entire scene from the barn. His retelling at the local saloon that night spread like wildfire across the territory, growing more elaborate with each telling. Soon, the story of the rancher's wife who outgunned 3 notorious outlaws became the stuff of legend, though Rose herself never bothered to correct any of the embellishments. She was too busy teaching the other ranch wives in the area how to shoot straight and keep their guns well maintained, all while running the most prosperous cattle operation in the territory. In the years that followed, would-be troublemakers gave the Anderson ranch a wide berth. The sight of Rose Anderson calmly working in her garden, a gun belt always within reach, became something of a tourist attraction for passing cowboys. They'd tip their hats respectfully as they rode by, having heard the stories of the day three outlaws learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, and that the deadliest gunslinger in the territory preferred to do her shooting between batches of biscuits. Word of Rose Anderson's showdown with the outlaws traveled faster than a prairie fire in drought season. Within a week, every saloon from Santa Fe to Denver buzzed with tales of the rancher's wife who could outshoot any man foolish enough to test her. But while most celebrated her courage, darker forces were taking notice of the woman who had humiliated their men. In the shadows of a dimly lit office in Colorado Territory, a man known only as the boss listened intently as his wounded men recounted their failure. His cattle rustling operation had been profitable until Thomas Anderson started interfering, and now this unexpected development with Anderson's wife complicated matters further. The boss's weathered face remained emotionless as he formulated a new plan, one that would require more subtlety than brute force. Back at the Anderson ranch, life had settled into an uneasy routine. Rose noticed more visitors than usual passing by, some clearly there just to catch a glimpse of the woman from the stories. She took it all in stride, continuing her daily routine of ranch work, though now she spent extra time training the ranch hands' wives in self-defense. Her shooting classes behind the barn became a regular social event for the women of neighboring ranches. "Remember, ladies," Rose would say, setting up cans on the fence post, "it's not about strength. It's about accuracy and staying calm." She demonstrated her point by hitting 6 cans in rapid succession, each shot precise and controlled. The women watched in admiration, many of them already showing remarkable improvement in their marksmanship. One particularly hot afternoon, a well-dressed stranger rode up to the ranch. His clothes were too fine for a typical traveler, and his manner too polished for a common cowboy. Rose watched him approach from the kitchen window, her hand instinctively moving to her hidden revolver. "Mrs. Anderson," he called out, removing his hat respectfully. "I represent the Western Cattlemen's Association. May I have a moment of your time?" Rose stepped onto the porch, maintaining a careful distance. "The association, you say? Funny, my husband hasn't mentioned any expected visitors from them." The man smiled smoothly, producing a letter from his jacket. "We're conducting a survey of successful ranches in the territory. Your operation has caught our attention, especially given recent events." He paused, his eyes studying her reaction. "We're interested in offering the Anderson Ranch special protection services, for a reasonable fee, of course." Rose's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes hardened. She recognized an extortion attempt when she heard one. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, sir, but we manage our protection just fine. As some folks recently discovered." The man's smile didn't waver, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Mrs. Anderson, surely you understand that one lucky afternoon doesn't guarantee future safety. The territories can be dangerous, especially for successful ranches like yours. Accidents happen. Cattle disappear. Buildings catch fire." Rose stepped forward, her voice carrying across the yard where several ranch hands had paused in their work. "Are you threatening us, sir?" "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "Simply stating facts. The association's protection is quite thorough. Your husband's interference, your husband's concerns about certain cattle operations would no longer need to trouble him." Rose's laugh caught him off guard. It wasn't the nervous titter he expected, but a genuine sound of amusement. "You know what I find interesting," she said, casually leaning against the porch post. "You claim to be from the Cattlemen's Association, but your boots have never seen a day of ranch work. Your hands are too soft, and you sit a horse like a city banker. The man's polished facade cracked slightly. Rose continued, her voice carrying clearly to ensure the ranch hands, and any hidden witnesses, could hear every word. So why don't you ride back to whoever really sent you and deliver a message? The Anderson Ranch doesn't pay protection money to criminals. We don't bow to threats. And if your boss wants to test how lucky that afternoon was, he's welcome to try. The stranger's face darkened. You're making a serious mistake, Mrs. Anderson. The boss doesn't take rejection well. And I don't take kindly to threats against my family, Rose replied. Now, I suggest you leave while you still can. My biscuits are about to burn, and I'd hate to have to wash blood out of my apron again this week. The man turned his horse, his rigid posture betraying his anger. You'll regret this decision, Mrs. Anderson. One way or another. Rose watched him ride away, her mind already working on preparations. That evening, when Thomas returned from town, she filled him in on the visitor. Her husband's face grew grave as he recognized the implications. They're getting desperate, Thomas said, pulling out a stack of letters from his saddlebag. I've been gathering evidence of their operation. Cattle disappearing from small ranches, mysterious fires, ranchers suddenly selling their land for pennies on the dollar. The marshal's building a case, but it's taking time. Rose studied the letters, her expression thoughtful. They'll make another move soon. But this time, they'll be smarter about it. No more direct confrontations. Maybe we should sell, Thomas suggested, though his tone indicated he already knew her answer. Move somewhere safer. Rose shook her head, a familiar determination in her eyes. This is our home. Besides, she added with a slight smile, running from bullies only teaches them that bullying works. No, we'll face whatever comes. But we'll do it smart. That night, Rose wrote letters to several trusted neighbors, calling in favors and setting plans in motion. She knew the next attack wouldn't be as straightforward as the first. The boss, whoever he was, would have learned from his men's mistakes. He would come at them sideways, looking for weaknesses, trying to break their resolve through fear and isolation. But Rose had learned a few things during her years as a stagecoach guard. She knew that the best defense wasn't just about being ready to fight, it was about being prepared for every possibility. As she checked the priming on her revolvers before bed, she smiled, remembering something her father used to say, the most dangerous predator isn't always the one with the sharpest claws, but the one with the patience to wait for the right moment. The boss might have patience, but so did Rose Anderson. And she had something he didn't, a lifetime of being underestimated by men who thought they could break her. Each time, she'd proven them wrong. This time would be no different. The only question was, how far would the boss go before he learned his lesson? The change came gradually to the Anderson Ranch, like storm clouds building on a distant horizon. First, their regular suppliers in town started making excuses about delayed deliveries. Then neighboring ranchers began missing their usual social calls, offering vague explanations about being too busy. Rose watched it all with quiet observation, noting how the boss's influence spread like poison through their community. But Rose Anderson hadn't survived years as a stagecoach guard by being passive. She kept detailed records of every suspicious incident, building a paper trail that would later prove invaluable. When the general store suddenly doubled their prices for the Anderson Ranch, she documented it. When their cattle buyers mysteriously found problems with their perfectly healthy herds, she wrote it down, complete with dates and names. One crisp morning, Rose rode into town for supplies, her rifle conspicuously strapped to her saddle. The usually bustling main street grew oddly quiet as she approached, shopkeepers and townspeople averting their eyes. Only old Mrs. Chen from the laundry met her gaze directly, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. Inside the general store, the owner, Mr. Patterson, fumbled nervously with his ledger. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson, but we're out of most items you're asking for." Rose placed her hands on the counter, her voice gentle but firm. "That's interesting, Mr. Patterson, considering I can see those exact items on your shelves right now." The shopkeeper's face reddened. "It's just, there have been some suggestions about doing business with the Anderson Ranch." "Suggestions?" Rose leaned forward slightly. "Or threats?" Patterson's silence was answer enough. Rose nodded thoughtfully, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. "Well, I have some suggestions of my own. These are copies of all the evidence my husband has gathered about the boss's operation. Names, dates, witnesses. If anything happens to us, these documents will find their way to every marshal and newspaper in 3 territories." She watched understanding dawn in Patterson's eyes as she continued, "So you have a choice to make. You can let fear of the boss control you, or you can remember that this is your store in your town. The boss might make threats, but ask yourself, how many times has he actually had to follow through on them? How much of his power comes from people being too afraid to stand up to him?" Patterson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the order list Rose had brought. What would you like to purchase today, Mrs. Anderson?" By the time Rose left the store with her supplies, word had already spread through town. The woman who had outgunned 3 outlaws was now challenging the boss's entire operation, not with bullets, but with something potentially more dangerous, the truth. Back at the ranch, Rose found Thomas in deep discussion with 2 unexpected visitors, U.S. Marshal Hayes and his deputy. They looked up as she entered, and Thomas quickly made introductions. "The marshal's been building a case against the boss for months," Thomas explained. "Turns out our evidence might be the key to bringing down his entire operation." Marshal Hayes nodded gravely. "Mrs. Anderson, your husband's documentation of the protection racket, combined with witness statements about the attempt on your life, could be exactly what we need. But I won't lie to you, testifying against the boss would be dangerous." Rose set her purchases down with deliberate calm. "More dangerous than letting him continue to terrorize honest folks? More dangerous than watching our community tear itself apart from fear?" The marshal's weathered face broke into a slight smile. "I can see why the outlaws had trouble with you, ma'am." As they discussed strategy, Rose noticed movement through the window, riders approaching, but not the usual threatening kind. These were their neighbors, led by Mrs. Chen from the laundry and Mr. Patterson from the general store. Behind them came more townspeople, ranchers, and farmers. Thomas stepped onto the porch to greet them, surprise evident on his face. Patterson spoke first, his voice stronger than it had been in the store. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Anderson, we've been talking. About the boss, about what's happening to our town. We're tired of being afraid." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame straight with dignity. "My father didn't cross an ocean and build a business here just to hand it over to criminals. We want to help." One by one, people began sharing their stories, the threats, the extortion, the fear they'd lived under. Marshal Hayes listened intently, taking notes, while Rose watched the scene unfold. This, she realized, was what the boss truly feared. Not her gun, not Thomas's evidence, but the moment people stopped being afraid and started standing together. As the impromptu meeting continued, Rose slipped away to check the property's defenses. The boss wouldn't take this lying down. He'd strike back, harder than before, especially once word reached him about the marshal's involvement. But for the first time, they wouldn't be facing him alone. That evening, after their visitors had gone, Rose and Thomas sat on their porch, watching the sun set over their land. "You know they'll come for us," Thomas said quietly. "The boss can't afford to let this spread." Rose checked the prime on her revolver, a habit as natural as breathing. "Let them come. But this time, we'll be ready. Not just us, but everyone." She smiled, remembering the determination she'd seen in their neighbor's eyes. The boss is about to learn that fear is only powerful until people stop being afraid. As darkness settled over the ranch, Rose made her final rounds, checking windows and doors. In the distance, a coyote howled, and she paused to listen. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, something had shifted. The boss's greatest weapon, isolation through fear, was crumbling. In her years guarding stage coaches, Rose had learned that the most dangerous moment wasn't during the robbery itself, but in that tense space just before, when everything hung in the balance. They were in that space now, balanced between fear and courage, between submission and defiance. But this time, she wasn't facing the danger alone from atop a stage coach. This time, she had an entire community at her back. The next move belonged to the boss, and Rose Anderson would be ready for whatever came. After all, she'd learned long ago that the deadliest force on the frontier wasn't a gun or a gang of outlaws, it was the power of people standing together against tyranny. The boss's response came at dawn, 3 days after the community meeting at the Anderson ranch. Rose was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, when she smelled it, smoke, carried on the morning wind. She rushed outside to find the horizon painted orange with multiple fires, strategically set around different properties in the valley. It was a clever move, she had to admit. With fires threatening several ranches simultaneously, the community would have to split up to fight them, leaving each property vulnerable. The boss was forcing them to choose between protecting their own homes or helping their neighbors. But the boss had underestimated the power of preparation. Rose grabbed the bell rope and rang out the predetermined signal, 3 long peals followed by 2 short ones. Within minutes, riders emerged from various directions, following the emergency plans they developed during secret meetings over the past few days. Mrs. Chen's group has the north fire, Thomas called out as he mounted his horse. Patterson's handling the east. We've got runners warning every ranch in the valley. He paused, looking at his wife. What about you? Rose was already checking her revolvers. I'll coordinate from here. This isn't just about the fires, it's a distraction. The boss will have something else planned. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. In their years together, he'd learned to trust his wife's instincts. As he rode off to help organize the firefighting efforts, Rose positioned herself on the porch, her eyes scanning the landscape. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch, perfect cover for anyone trying to approach unseen. Inside the house, she'd positioned several of the ranch hands' wives, all armed and watching different approaches to the property. These women had spent weeks practicing with Rose, learning not just how to shoot, but how to think strategically. Today, they would put those lessons to use. The first sign of trouble came from the south pasture. A group of riders, taking advantage of the chaos caused by the fires, was driving off a large portion of the Andersons' cattle. Rose smiled grimly, they'd anticipated this too. Hidden among the cattle were several ranch hands, dressed as common cowhands but armed and ready. But the cattle raid wasn't the real threat either. Rose knew the boss's style by now. These were all diversions, meant to draw attention and resources away from something bigger. She remained at her post, watching and waiting. Her patience was rewarded mid-morning when she spotted unusual movement near the creek that ran behind the property. Several men, dressed in dark clothes that helped them blend with the shadows of the creek bed, were making their way toward the ranch house. Their approach was professional, coordinated, these weren't common thugs, but skilled gunmen. Rose calmly walked inside, where Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women were stationed. They're coming up the creek bed, she said quietly. Remember what we practiced. No one shoots unless I give the signal. The women nodded, their faces showing nervous determination. Rose positioned them carefully, then returned to the porch, making sure she was visible. She wanted to be seen, wanted to draw attention. The bread dough still sat on the kitchen counter, slowly rising in the warm air. The gunmen emerged from the creek bed with practiced precision, spreading out to surround the house. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his chin, stepped forward. Rose recognized him from wanted posters, the wolf, one of the most notorious hired guns in the territory. "Mrs. Anderson," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I believe you've been causing my employer some inconvenience." Rose wiped her hands on her apron, appearing casual though every sense was alert. "Your employer has been causing this entire community considerable inconvenience for quite some time now." The wolf smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to deliver a message. One final chance to reconsider your position. The boss is willing to be generous, sell the ranch for a fair price, drop all this business with the marshal, and everyone walks away happy. And if we decline? Then we burn it all down. Not just your ranch, but everything you've built. The boss has men positioned throughout the territory. One word from him, and every allied ranch, every supportive business in town, they all go up in flames. Their owners along with them." Rose's expression remained unchanged, but her mind was racing. This was it, the real threat, the one they'd been waiting for. The wolf was too smart to be bluffing, which meant the boss had committed significant resources to this operation. It was a vulnerable position, if you knew how to exploit it. "That's quite an operation your boss has planned," Rose said conversationally. "Must have taken a lot of men, a lot of coordination. Tell me, does the boss always put all his cards on the table at once?" The wolf's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something wasn't right. Before he could respond, shots rang out from multiple directions, not at the ranch, but from the distant hills surrounding the valley. Signal shots, followed by more, creating a symphony of gunfire that echoed through the morning air. Rose smiled. "While you were busy setting fires and threatening ranches, Marshal Hayes and his deputies were positioning themselves throughout the territory. Every one of the boss's men is currently surrounded. You see, we've been feeding him information, letting him think he knew our plans. All so he'd commit his forces exactly as we wanted." The wolf's hand twitched toward his gun, but Rose's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't. There are 4 armed women in this house with rifles trained on you and your men. I've personally trained each of them, and I can assure you, they're excellent shots." As if to emphasize her point, one of the women fired a warning shot that kicked up dust near the wolf's feet. The hired gunman froze, realizing he'd walked into a trap. In the distance, they could hear more gunfire as the marshal's men engaged the boss's forces. "Now then," Rose continued, her voice pleasant but firm, "I suggest you and your men drop your weapons. The boss's empire is falling as we speak. The only question is whether you'll be remembered as the man smart enough to surrender, or another fool who underestimated a rancher's wife." The wolf looked at Rose for a long moment, then slowly raised his hands. One by one, his men followed suit. As they were being disarmed, Rose heard horses approaching, Thomas returning with news that the fires were under control, minimal damage done. The boss's grand plan, meant to destroy their community, had instead become the catalyst for its salvation. Later, as Rose finally returned to her bread dough, she allowed herself a small smile. The boss had made the same mistake as those first 3 outlaws. He'd assumed that the most dangerous thing on the frontier was the person holding the gun. But Rose Anderson had learned long ago that true strength lay not in weapons, but in the bonds between people willing to stand together against tyranny. The aftermath of the confrontation swept through the territory like a summer windstorm. Marshal Hayes and his deputies had captured most of the boss's men in their coordinated operation, but the boss himself remained elusive. The wolf, now in custody, had proved surprisingly talkative once he realized the extent of the operation's collapse. Rose spent the week after the showdown helping neighboring ranches repair fire damage and restore order to the valley. The community's spirit, rather than being broken by the boss's attack, had grown stronger. Ranchers who'd barely spoken to each other for years now worked side by side, rebuilding fences and sharing resources. One evening, as Rose rode back from helping the Chun family repair their laundry's roof, she noticed unusual tracks leading toward the old miller's cabin. The abandoned building had stood empty for years, but something about those tracks raised her guard. They were too fresh, too deliberate, as if someone had tried to hide them but wasn't familiar with the territory's soil. She dismounted, leading her horse off the trail. Years of stagecoach guard work had taught her to trust her instincts. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, but there was still enough light to work with. As she approached the cabin, she noted small details: a fresh scuff on the door frame, a recently disturbed patch of weeds. Inside the cabin, she found evidence of recent occupation: still warm coffee grounds, fresh bread crumbs, and most tellingly, a familiar-looking letter opener on the rough-hewn table. She'd seen it before, on the desk of the well-dressed stranger who'd tried to threaten her that day on her porch. "Impressive instincts, Mrs. Anderson," a cultured voice spoke from the shadows. "I can see why my men had such trouble with you." Rose turned slowly. In the dim light, she could make out a figure, well-dressed, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and an aristocratic bearing. This, then, was the boss. He looked more like a banker than a criminal mastermind, which, she supposed, was probably how he'd maintained his anonymity for so long. "I wondered if you'd show yourself," Rose replied calmly, keeping her hands visible but ready. "Though I admit, I expected you to run further than the old miller's cabin." The boss stepped forward, his movements precise and controlled. "Sometimes the best hiding place is right under everyone's nose. Besides, I needed to understand." "Understand what?" "How one woman managed to dismantle an empire I spent 15 years building." His tone held more curiosity than anger. "Was it luck? Determination? Or something else?" Rose studied him carefully. "You want to know your mistake? You built your empire on fear. Fear works, for a while. But eventually, people get tired of being afraid. They remember who they are, what they're capable of. And when that happens, fear turns to strength." The boss nodded thoughtfully. "An interesting philosophy. But tell me, Mrs. Anderson, now that you've found me, what do you plan to do? Call for the marshal? Try to take me in yourself?" "Actually," Rose smiled slightly, "I don't plan to do either." She moved to the cabin's single window, gesturing outside. In the gathering dusk, multiple riders could be seen approaching the cabin from different directions. "You see, when I noticed those tracks, I sent word to the community. Not to the marshal, not to the law, but to the people you've terrorized for years. The ranchers, the shopkeepers, the farmers, they're all here." The boss's composed facade cracked slightly as he realized the significance. These weren't lawmen coming to arrest him, these were his victims, coming to witness his downfall. "They deserve to see this," Rose continued. "To see that the man who haunted their dreams and threatened their families is just that, a man. Not some all-powerful shadow, not some unstoppable force. Just a man who's lost everything because he underestimated the power of community." The cabin door opened, and Thomas entered, followed by Marshal Hayes. Behind them came others, Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Chin, ranchers and townspeople, all bearing witness. The boss looked at them, his aristocratic features twisting with understanding. His reign of terror hadn't been ended by lawmen or gunfighters, but by ordinary people standing together. "You know what I find interesting?" Rose said, addressing everyone in the cabin. "For all your power, all your men, all your elaborate schemes, you never actually had to fire a single shot. Your weapon was fear itself. You convinced everyone that you were invincible, that resistance was hopeless. And people believed it, until they didn't." Marshal Hayes stepped forward with handcuffs, but the boss's attention remained on Rose. "You've doomed them, you know," he said quietly. "Without my organization, without the structure I brought to these territories, it will be chaos. Other gangs, other bosses will move in. You've solved nothing." Rose shook her head. "You still don't understand. Look around you. These people, they're not afraid anymore. They've learned to stand together, to protect each other. Any gang trying to move in will find something very different from what you found, not isolated ranchers and terrified townspeople, but a community ready to defend itself. As the boss was led away, Rose watched the gathered crowd. There was no celebration, no cheering, just quiet determination and relief on their faces. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger. The boss's reign of terror had ended not with a dramatic shootout, but with the simple courage of ordinary people standing together. Later that night, as Rose and Thomas sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, she thought about the strange twists of fate that had led to this moment. How 3 outlaws, underestimating a rancher's wife, had inadvertently sparked a revolution against tyranny. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "the story's already spreading. About how you tracked him down, how you orchestrated his capture." Rose smiled. "Let them tell their stories. The truth is, I just helped people remember something they'd forgotten, that the strongest force on the frontier isn't guns or gangs or fear. It's the power of people standing together, watching out for each other. Everything else just flows from that." In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Rose felt a deep sense of peace settle over the valley. The boss was right about one thing: there would be other challenges, other threats. But they would face them together, as a community. After all, that was the real lesson she'd learned all those years ago as a stagecoach guard: the best defense isn't a quick draw or a steady aim, but the knowledge that you're not facing danger alone. Spring arrived in the territory with unprecedented promise. The capture of the boss had sparked changes that rippled through the community like waves across a pond. Rose watched these changes unfold from her familiar spot on the ranch house porch, where she still maintained her habit of keeping a watchful eye while going about her daily tasks. The trial had been the talk of 3 territories. The boss, revealed as former railroad executive Richard Wellington, had built his criminal empire using the same methodical planning he'd once used to lay train tracks across the frontier. His ledgers, discovered in the miller's cabin, exposed a network of corruption that stretched from local officials to distant city banks. But more remarkable than the trial itself was the transformation of the community. The alliance forged in crisis had evolved into something permanent and powerful. Rose saw it in the way former rivals now gathered to help rebuild damaged properties, in how townspeople and ranchers alike had learned to watch out for each other. One bright morning, Rose rode into town for supplies, but this time the street didn't grow quiet at her approach. Instead, she was greeted by warm smiles and friendly waves. The general store, once a place of tense confrontations, had become a hub of community activity. "Mrs. Anderson." Mr. Patterson called out as she entered. "Just in time. We're organizing the spring cattle drive schedules. The ranchers thought you might have some insights about security arrangements." Rose smiled, noting how the store had changed. A new bulletin board dominated one wall, covered with notices about community events, shared resources, and warning systems. Next to it hung a detailed map of the territory, marked with patrol routes and emergency meeting points, all ideas that had grown from their resistance to the boss. "Actually," she said, "I've been thinking about that. The old stagecoach routes had some natural checkpoint positions that might be useful." As they discussed plans, Mrs. Chen entered the store, carrying a stack of papers. The laundry owner had emerged as an unexpected leader in the community's transformation, her keen mind for organization proving invaluable. "The Women's Shooting Club wants to expand," Mrs. Chen announced. "We've had requests from 3 neighboring towns to help them start their own chapters." What had begun as Rose's informal self-defense lessons had evolved into something much larger. Women from across the territory now gathered regularly to learn not just shooting, but strategy, organization, and community defense. The club served as both a practical resource and a symbol of the community's new strength. Later that afternoon, Rose attended a meeting at the newly established Community Council. The council chamber, once the rarely used back room of the saloon, was packed with a diverse group of citizens, ranchers, merchants, farmers, and townspeople who had learned to work together during the crisis. The railway company's new representative arrived yesterday, Thomas reported to the council. Seems they're very interested in negotiating fair rates now that Wellington's influence is gone. Funny how that works. Rose listened as the council discussed various matters: water rights, grazing agreements, mutual defense arrangements. Problems that once would have led to bitter disputes were now addressed through cooperation and shared understanding. The boss's reign of terror had taught them the value of standing together. After the meeting, Rose rode out to check on the neighboring ranches. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the valley as she crested a hill overlooking the territory. From this vantage point, she could see the changes that had taken place over the past months. New fence lines marked shared grazing agreements between once feuding ranchers. Fresh painted watchtowers stood at strategic points, staffed by rotating volunteers. Riders moved between properties in organized patrols, a system developed after studying the stagecoach routes Rose had once guarded. At the Chen Ranch, she found a group of women practicing at the newly constructed shooting range. Among them was young Beth Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who had shown a remarkable talent for both marksmanship and leadership. "Mrs. Anderson," Beth called out excitedly. "We've been practicing that quick-draw technique you showed us. Want to see?" Rose dismounted, watching as the women demonstrated their skills. Their confidence had grown tremendously, and with it, their ability to protect themselves and their community. But more importantly, they had learned to work together, to trust and support one another. "You've built something remarkable here," a familiar voice said. Rose turned to find Marshall Hayes, who had ridden up quietly behind her. "The community built it," Rose corrected. "I just helped them see what was possible." The marshal nodded thoughtfully. "Word's spreading, you know. Other towns, other territories, they're talking about what happened here. How one community stood up to the boss and won. How they didn't just drive out the threat but built something stronger in its place." Rose watched as Beth helped another woman adjust her stance, showing the same patience and attention to detail that Rose had once used to teach her. "That's the real victory," she said. "Not catching the boss, but showing people they don't have to live in fear. That they're stronger together than any force trying to divide them." As the sun began to set, Rose rode back to her ranch, passing the miller's cabin along the way. The old building had been repurposed as a community storehouse and emergency shelter, its dark history transformed into something useful and good. The evening brought a familiar scene: neighbors gathering on the Anderson Ranch porch, sharing news and plans. Children played in the yard while their parents discussed everything from cattle prices to defense strategies. The atmosphere was relaxed but vigilant. They had learned to balance security with community, strength with compassion. Thomas joined her as she watched the gathering. "Remember when this all started?" he asked. "With 3 outlaws who thought they could intimidate a rancher's wife?" Rose smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. "They did us a favor, really. Showed us what we were capable of. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people of their own strength." As darkness settled over the valley, Rose completed her nightly security check, a habit she maintained despite the peace that had settled over the territory. The boss's reign had taught them all valuable lessons about vigilance and preparation. But it had taught them something even more important: that the greatest security came not from weapons or walls, but from the bonds between people who had learned to trust and depend on each other. In the years that followed, the story of Rose Anderson and the community's stand against the boss became legend throughout the frontier. But Rose knew the real story wasn't about her, or even about the boss. It was about ordinary people finding their courage, standing together against tyranny, and building something stronger than fear. The old-timers still talked about the day 3 outlaws made the fatal mistake of threatening a rancher's wife. But the wiser ones understood that the real story was what came after, how that moment of crisis had sparked a transformation that would shape the territory for generations to come. As autumn painted the territory in rich golds and reds, visitors began arriving from distant towns and settlements. They came seeking something more valuable than gold, knowledge. The story of how one community had transformed itself from victims to victors had spread far beyond the valley's boundaries, carried by traveling merchants and newspaper accounts. Rose found herself hosting a steady stream of delegates from other communities, each eager to learn how they had accomplished what many had thought impossible. On this particular morning, she sat with representatives from 3 different territories, sharing not just the story of their triumph over the boss, but the practical lessons they'd learned along the way. The most common mistake, Rose explained, pouring coffee for her guests, is thinking it's all about weapons and warriors. The real strength of any community lies in its connections, how people work together, how they support each other, how they share information and resources. The visitors listened intently as Rose outlined the systems they developed, the warning networks, the shared patrol routes, the community council that gave everyone a voice in decisions affecting their safety and prosperity. But more than the practical details, they were struck by the visible evidence of success all around them. Through the window, they could see the bustling activity of a community thriving without fear. Children played freely in the streets of town, women traveled alone between ranches without concern, and business flourished in an atmosphere of mutual trust and cooperation. But surely there must be disputes, one visitor pressed. How do you handle conflicts between members of the community? Rose smiled, remembering the early days after the boss's capture. We established the Community Mediation Council. Instead of letting disagreements fester or escalate, we bring them to the council for resolution. Mrs. Chen heads it now. Turns out her experience managing different personalities at the laundry made her perfect for the role. Later that afternoon, Rose rode out with the visitors to show them the practical implementations of their security measures. They passed one of the watchtowers, where Beth Chen was training a new group of volunteers in the art of territorial observation. We rotate duties, Rose explained. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Some patrol, some watch, some coordinate. The important thing is that everyone has a role, everyone has a voice. As they rode, they encountered one of the regular patrols, a mixed group of ranchers and townspeople who had once barely acknowledged each other's existence. Now they worked together seamlessly, their former differences forgotten in the face of their shared responsibility. Your reputation for marksmanship is legendary, Mrs. Anderson, one of the visitors commented. Do you still teach shooting? I do, Rose nodded, but not just shooting. We teach awareness, strategy, cooperation. The Women's Shooting Club has become more of a leadership academy. We're training the next generation to be not just defenders, but leaders. They crested a hill overlooking the valley, and Rose reined her horse to a stop. Below them stretched a landscape transformed not by force or fear, but by unity and purpose. New construction dotted the valley, community storehouses, meeting halls, training grounds. But more striking than the physical changes was the visible evidence of cooperation, shared grazing lands, communal farming projects, joint business ventures between former competitors. The boss's biggest mistake, Rose reflected, wasn't underestimating me that day. It was underestimating the potential of people to overcome their fears and work together. He thought he could control us through isolation and fear. Instead, he gave us the push we needed to discover our collective strength. As the sun began to set, they returned to town for the weekly community gathering. These meetings, once focused solely on security concerns, had evolved into celebrations of community achievement. Tonight, they were honoring the graduation of the first class from the Women's Leadership Academy, an institution that had grown from Rose's initial shooting lessons. The saloon, once a place of wary glances and whispered threats, now buzzed with the energy of a community united in purpose. Rose watched as Mrs. Chen's daughter Beth presented her project, a comprehensive plan for extending their community defense network to neighboring settlements. The next generation, Thomas whispered proudly to Rose as they watched. They're taking what we built and making it even stronger. After the presentations, as the community celebrated, Rose found herself in conversation with Marshall Hayes, who had become a regular visitor to the valley. "You've done more than just secure one community," he observed. "You've created a model that others can follow. The territorial governor's office is studying your methods, looking to implement them across the frontier." Rose shook her head modestly. "We just did what needed to be done. The real credit belongs to everyone who found the courage to stand together." As the evening wound down, Rose stood on her familiar porch, watching the stars emerge above the valley. The territory was changing, she realized. The wild frontier was gradually giving way to something new, not through force or domination, but through cooperation and shared purpose. A rider approached in the gathering dusk, another visitor seeking wisdom, another community looking to transform itself. Rose smiled, remembering the day 3 outlaws had made their fatal mistake. They had thought they were confronting a simple rancher's wife. Instead, they had unknowingly sparked a movement that would reshape the frontier. "Welcome to our valley," Rose called out to the approaching rider. "You've caught us at a good time. Tomorrow's the start of our monthly community planning session. You'll get to see firsthand how we turned fear into strength, division into unity." The rider dismounted, looking around with wonder at the peaceful scene. "Is it true what they say? That it all started with one woman standing up to 3 outlaws?" Rose laughed softly. "That's part of the story, but not the most important part. The real story is about what happens when people stop being afraid and start working together. That's the tale worth telling, and it's still being written every day in communities across the frontier." As she led the visitor toward the house, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The boss had sought to build an empire through fear and division. Instead, he had inadvertently helped create something far more powerful, a community united in purpose, strength, and determination. The legend of the rancher's wife who outgunned 3 outlaws would always be part of frontier lore. But the true legacy of those events wasn't in the gunfight itself, but in what came after, the transformation of a frightened, divided community into a model of cooperation and resilience that would inspire generations to come. 10 years had passed since the day 3 outlaws made their fatal mistake of threatening a rancher's wife. The territory had changed so much that visitors often had trouble believing the stories of its troubled past. On a warm summer evening, Rose Anderson sat on her familiar porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, reflecting on the decade of transformation. The Anderson Ranch had become more than just a cattle operation, it was now a center of learning and community organization. The old barn had been converted into a meeting hall where representatives from settlements across the frontier gathered to learn about community building and cooperative defense. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Thomas said, joining her on the porch. They watched as a group of young riders practiced formation drills in the distance, the newest class of the Frontier Peace Officers, a program that had grown from their early community patrol system. "Remember when we thought we'd have to sell the ranch?" Rose smiled, thinking back to those tense days. "Now look at it. We're running more cattle than ever, and doing so much more besides." The valley had become a model of frontier cooperation. The watchtowers still stood, but they now served as trading posts and communication centers as much as security stations. The community council had evolved into a sophisticated governing body that other territories sought to emulate. Mrs. Chen appeared at the gate, accompanied by her daughter Beth, who had grown from an eager student into one of the territory's most respected leaders. Beth now headed the Women's Frontier Alliance, an organization that had spread across 3 territories, teaching self-defense, leadership, and community organization. The governor's office sent another inquiry, Beth announced as she approached. "They want to establish similar programs in the Southern Territories. They're particularly interested in our conflict resolution methods." Rose nodded, unsurprised. Their system of community mediation had proven remarkably effective at preventing the kind of disputes that once led to violence. The boss's old tactics of intimidation and division seemed almost quaint now, relics of a darker time. As they discussed the governor's request, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced new visitors. This was a common sight now. Delegations arrived almost weekly, seeking to learn from their experience. But this group was special. Rose recognized the lead rider. It was Marshal Hayes, now promoted to Chief Marshal of the territory. "Mrs. Anderson," Hayes called out as he dismounted. "Still keeping watch from that porch, I see." "Old habits," Rose replied warmly. "Though these days, I'm watching for friends more often than foes." The marshal wasn't alone. With him was a young journalist from back east, eager to document the story of the territory's transformation. Rose had become accustomed to such visitors, though she always insisted that the story wasn't about her. "Is it true," the journalist asked, notebook in hand, "that it all began with a gunfight on this very porch?" Rose exchanged amused glances with Thomas. "That's where the legend starts, but it's not where the real story lies. The gunfight was just a moment. What matters is what came after. How people found their courage, how they learned to stand together." As the evening progressed, more familiar faces arrived. Mr. Patterson from the general store, now a respected community elder. The children who had once hidden from the boss's men, now grown into confident leaders themselves. Even some of the former outlaws who had chosen rehabilitation over prison, becoming productive members of the community they once terrorized. They gathered in the converted barn for the 10th anniversary celebration of their victory over the boss. But as Rose looked around at the assembled crowd, she realized they were celebrating something far more significant than the defeat of one man's criminal empire. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said, addressing the gathering. "Those three outlaws who started it all. They thought they were just threatening one woman on a remote ranch. They had no idea they were setting in motion changes that would transform the entire frontier." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many of them had their own stories of transformation, how they had moved from fear to courage, from isolation to community, from victims to leaders. "The boss thought he understood power," Rose continued. "He thought it came from fear, from forcing people to submit. But real power, the kind that builds rather than destroys, comes from people standing together, supporting each other, working for something bigger than themselves." As the celebration continued, Rose slipped away quietly to make her nightly rounds, another old habit she'd never abandoned. The territory was safer now than it had ever been, but she believed in remaining vigilant. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility to the community they'd built. Walking the familiar paths, she passed the old miller's cabin, now a museum of sorts, preserving the history of their struggle and transformation. Inside, alongside documented evidence of the boss's crimes, were testimonies of community triumph, stories of neighbors helping neighbors, of barriers broken down, of strength found in unity. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. In the distance, she could see the lights of new settlements that had sprung up in the valley, each one built on the principles they had learned through trial and error. A young rider approached, one of the community patrol members. "Evening rounds, Mrs. Anderson?" "Just keeping an eye on things," Rose replied. "Old habits die hard." The rider smiled. "My grandmother told me stories about the old days. About how afraid everyone was before you stood up to those outlaws." Rose shook her head. "I just showed them what was possible. The real courage came from every person who chose to stand together, to build something new." Returning to the celebration, Rose found Thomas waiting for her on their porch. "Still patrolling?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Someone has to set the example," she replied. "The frontier's safer now, but that's only because people learn to work together, to watch out for each other. We can never take that for granted." As the night drew to a close, the visitors began to depart, each carrying with them stories to share and lessons to implement in their own communities. The journalist approached Rose one last time. "Mrs. Anderson, if you could sum up the legacy of what happened here, what would you say?" Rose thought for a moment, looking out over the peaceful valley. I'd say that the greatest victory isn't won with guns or force, but with unity and understanding. Those three outlaws thought they were facing one woman alone. What they really faced was the power of an entire community waiting to discover its strength. Later that night, as Rose and Thomas sat on their porch under the stars, they could hear the distant sound of singing from the town, the community still celebrating, still strong, still united. The legend of the rancher's wife who outgunned three outlaws would always be part of their story. But the real legacy was in the community they'd built, the changes they'd inspired, and the lessons they'd taught about the true nature of strength and courage on the American frontier.